Ladies, gentlemen, good morning. This is Germinal Van. Hope everybody's well and happy Sunday. This video is to present my 13th book entitled The Economic Development of West Africa in the 21st Century, a theoretical and empirical analysis from a neoclassical perspective. It is a book of 482 pages. It contains 121 illustrations, which of course includes 112 figures and 9 tables. It has more than 500 footnotes. It has a lot of empirical data. It has a lot of mathematical equations in this book. What I tried to do in this book was to basically make a rigorous defense of the free market by using the scientific methods. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of late nights with little sleep in order to accomplish this work, in order to finish it completely. It's up to date my most significant work, and most of the books I've written so far were less voluminous and they were more concise. But this one is it's pretty large. It's very elaborate. So I hope the reader will definitely enjoy it. It's very empirical for anyone that likes to read basically positive books. This book is for you. If you want to read positive books, of course, about African politics, about African economics, and to learn about African history to a certain extent. So the reason why I decided to write this book in the first place is because we live in a globalized world, and the African continent is basically the last economic battleground of this century. That is why the Chinese already started their tacit economic colonization on Africa. They start moving swiftly. They start installing already military base in Djibouti and other Eastern African countries, and they started to trade already with African countries. They bring their people and they open businesses, and they're bringing basically a they're bringing competition against Western countries and the former colonial powers, I would say. So the last battleground is in Africa, but Africa in itself is way too big as a continent to thrive uniformly. It has to be divided in regional powers. And West Africa is the second most powerful region in the continent economically. First of all, we have the human capital in West Africa, we have the natural resources, we have the commodities to thrive. So what I'm trying to explain in this book uh, is to bring a solution, is to propose an alternative that I believe will enhance the economic development of West Africa on a long-term basis. So what I started in this book was to explain, first of all, what is development economics. So development economics is a branch of economics that deals with developing countries. It's basically the study of the economic development and the economic growth of developing countries. So basically countries in Latin America, countries in Southeast Asia, and of course countries in Africa. And in this work, I try to explain all the theories of economic growth and to select which appropriate tool, which economic tool will be the most adequate for West Africa. So there are basically four main uh, theories of economic growth. The first is the linear stage of growth model. It was developed by Rostow, who used to work for the U.S. government, and that theory is divided into 5 sections. So the first is called the traditional society. In that in that section, basically, it says that society is completely agricultural. So let's say it's like the U.S. at the time of the independence. Very agricultural. Poverty was significantly high. there was no there was no technology that was developed yet. So that is the first stage of the model. The second stage is called the precondition to take off. So in this one, people start to realize, or they people start to realize, sorry, about the resources they have that and they can use in order to start their economy. So they're aware that they have some resources that they can use that can create growth, but they don't know yet how to do it. So basically, it's the stage that people are becoming aware of their potential. The third stage is the third part of the stage. Basically is the takeoff stage. So the takeoff means that society starts to transitioning from an agricultural mindset to a more modern industrial mindset, and within that condition, society starts to use technological tools to transform its products. The fourth part of the stage is the drive to maturity. So in the drive to maturity, uh, the society basically transform its products and export them elsewhere. So society is becoming more mature. Its shift toward a more industrialized society, it's almost completed. And the last stage is called the age of high mass consumption. Basically, every natural resources and commodities that constitute the economy are being transformed within the society, and it increased consumption and people consume more and it increased income for everybody. So at this stage, society is fully matured. Society is completely independent and is completely industrialized. So one example I can give of that model is the Soviet model. So when Lenin and Stalin uh, engaged into a rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, they applied the linear stage model. The reason why it cannot work in West Africa is because we live in a century where where the time is no longer adaptable. It can work in some countries. Basically, this model can work in some countries that are more agricultural. So countries like Tanzania or maybe Burkina Faso, although Burkina Faso is in West Africa. But in the majority of West African countries, this model cannot work. Moreover, this model is also based on centrally planned economy. So you need the government to control the entire process, and this is not what West Africa needs because we live in a globalized society where we need to interact with each other. So this kind of model works for closed economy, but West Africa today is an open economy. The second theory of economic growth that I'm going to accentuate real quick is called the structural change theory. This theory was developed by Nobel laureate W. Arthur Lewis. He won the Nobel Prize in 1979, and he developed that model, which is basically the shift between agricultural societies and industrialized societies as well. But what he talks about in this model specifically is that the supply of labor is moving toward the manufacturing sector rather than staying in the agricultural sector. And since the manufacturing sector is mainly in cities, so those regions are being more developed than rural regions. So it creates a huge disproportion in a country. And Africa is a perfect example of that. When you look at African countries, their cities are completely developed. Like African cities looks like you would be in the United States or in Europe. But then when you go to the rural part of the country, it's like another country in itself. Like the level of poverty is so high that you would not recognize that the people who live in those regions are the same citizens of the country as those who live in the cities. So the problem with the structural change theory is that it creates a huge inequality of income. It creates a huge social inequality between people who live in the same country. Though, so it will incentivize people who live in the rural areas to move to the cities. So the rural areas will be less and less developed. So poverty will increase more. That is why I did not choose the structural change theory to in my work to propose a better economic development for West Africa. The third theory is called the dependency theory. So the dependency theory is the Marxist or the Marxian theory, which states that developing countries are poor because rich countries are the one that exploited the natural resources and the commodities of poor countries. So poor countries cannot transform their own materials. So rich countries exploit the natural resources, they fix the price, they take those resources, they bring them back to their country, so to Europe or to the US or to Japan, etc. They transform those products and then they resell those same products to the African people or to people living in those poor countries at a higher price. So dependency theories say that this is not fair. So they're calling basically for a economic nationalism. The problem with economic nationalism is that it creates a closed economy. And in a closed economy, there is no trade. And if there is no trade, it stagnates income per capita. It stagnates income per capita, it stagnates employment, and eventually is going to lead to a longer recession. That is why I did not choose the dependency theory as the tool to be used for the development of West Africa. The last one is the neoclassical theory. So the neoclassical theory is basically advocating for less government intervention in economic affairs. Note that the neoclassical theory has been used already in Africa, but there are three models within the neoclassical theory. You have the market-friendly approach, you have the free market approach, and you have the public choice approach. What has been used in Africa is the market-friendly approach. It has been used by the financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. And this method has produced mixed results. In other words, it did not produce the results that everybody expected. So this method was not used because it shows its limits. If it was used before and it didn't work, there was no point in using that. So the market friendly approach, was used as the structural adjustment programs. So those programs advocate for the liberalization of trade. Those national owned enterprise must be privately owned, so it will create jobs and etc. But the problem with that is that it creates more inequalities, and it did not help all the economies that they were supposed to help. It did not help them thrive. So the market friendly approach on top of that was very keen to intervention. They said we're going to let the economy run on its own, but we're prompt to intervene if there's some spillovers. So that is one of the reasons why I did not choose this this model within the neoclassical framework. I also did not choose the pure free market framework because the pure free market frameworks works in developed countries. What is important to understand here is that developed countries have the rule of law. In African countries, the rule of law is not, it's something that is not implemented in its completeness yet. So the pure free market approach will work it will work, for instance, for like anarcho-capitalist. But Africa is not an anarcho-capitalist society. Like Africans are still developing. So they still need, to some extent, some regulation, some government in order to continue the growth. So that method, the pure free market method, would work in a country like the US because the US is very much developed. The rule of law is already well implemented in this country. So there is no, so if they want to apply that, they could, but it would not work for West African societies. So I chose the public choice approach because the public choice approach recognize the role of the government to some extent, but it argues that the role of the government is not to regulate the economy at all, is to simply give the infrastructures for the layman to operate in the market process. By the infrastructure, we means that to loosen access to private property. It means that to give, to develop the buildings that will attract private investors to come and invest and develop the economy. Because the truth of the matter is, a market economy cannot operate if there is no infrastructures. That is why in Africa, cities are way more developed than rural areas because there is no infrastructure in rural areas. There's no infrastructures in the villages, but there's everything in the cities. That's why the cities are far more developed. That's why everybody comes to the cities. So we need infrastructures to to be able to implement the market process and let it run on its own. So that's what the public choice approach argues for. It argues for a significant restraint of government over economic activities. The role of the government is simply to protect and give access to private property. The role of the government, it is not to regulate the infrastructures. It is not to regulate any legislation on the market. Its role is simply to let the market do its job and to only provide the infrastructures to the layman to stimulate growth within society. That is the four major theories of economic growth that I developed in the first part of this book. The second part of this book, it's simply to I simply made a case study for each of the major powers in West Africa, which are Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal. I will not be able to develop each of them because it's pretty long, but I made a case. I assess each of these countries by the five elements of economic growth, which are human capital, property rights, consumption, inflation, and of course unemployment. So I diligently assess each of these factors for each of these countries, and I applied the public trust growth model, which is the economic model that I developed in this book. It's a new theory that I developed, and I hope that eventually it will be recognized by the scientific community as a new economic tool that could be used in development economics. And the third and last part of this book is basically the recommendations that I made. I made four major recommendations. The first, of course, is to liberalize the market in West Africa, basically to liberalize trade because West Africans do not trade with each other. They trade with other countries, but they do not trade with each other, which is predicamental. The the second recommendation I made was to democratize the political process. So it's to fight against rent seeking, it's to fight against corruption, is to endorse the rule of law as a cultural feature in order to enhance our development. The third recommendation I made was the privatization of industries. We need more industries to be privatized in Africa because it will create economic growth, it will create employment, it will lift many people out of poverty. And the last recommendation is more political. It's to create a regional federalism in Africa. Africa is way too big to be one unitary government. It would create an unprecedented tyranny in West Africa and in Africa in general. So I believe that if West Africa can create its own federal government based on the cultural features that we share, it would be easier for the continent to develop, because each regions of the continent will create their own government, their own economic system, and we compete with each other. It will stimulate competition, it will stimulate growth, it will force people to be more efficient. So these are the four major recommendations that I made, and I believe that hopefully this book would be appreciated not just by the layman who reads it, but also by the authorities in West African governments who are seeking for better solutions to improve the living conditions of their people. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the presentation of this book. The book is available on Amazon.com. It is also available on eBay, Google Books, and other retail online stores. So feel free to grab your copy, a paperback copy and ebook. So you have the choice to pick whatever fits best your reading requirements. Thank you very much for listening to me, and see you guys next time.